The small ship called Helena floated in the empty darkness between stars like a tiny fish in an enormous ocean. Inside the narrow bridge, Captain Daniel Pierce stood with his hands gripped tight on the rail in front of him. His eyes were locked on the main screen where an alien face stared back at him with cold reptilian eyes. The creature's name was Vexthar, and he commanded the fleet of 47 massive warships that now surrounded the Helena like wolves circling wounded prey. Vexthar's mouth opened to show rows of sharp teeth as he spoke through the translation machine. His words came out in perfect English, but with a mechanical edge that made them sound even more threatening. He told Daniel that he must give up the location of Earth or watch his ship and crew die in the next few minutes. The alien seemed completely confident that Daniel had no choice but to obey. Sophie Grant sat at her station to Daniel's left, and her fingers moved fast across the controls. She was trying to keep the Calreth attackers out of their computer systems, while sweat dripped down her face. The enemy hackers were hitting their defenses hard, and she didn't know how much longer she could hold them back. Every few seconds, another warning light flashed on her screen, showing another system under attack. Kyle Bennett worked at the navigation station and watched the positions of all 47 enemy ships on his display. Each one of those vessels carried enough weapons to destroy a city in seconds. The Helena had almost no weapons at all because it was built for diplomacy and exploration, not war. They had basic shields and some small defensive lasers, but nothing that could fight back against this kind of force. Daniel kept his face calm, even though his heart was beating fast enough to hurt. The Helena was supposed to be humanity's first peaceful contact with a new alien species. They came with messages of friendship and hopes for trade and cultural exchange. Instead, the Calreth had immediately surrounded them and demanded surrender. Vexthar had explained in cold, simple terms that his empire had conquered 73 different species across this region of space. He planned to make humanity number 74. The alien commander leaned forward on the screen, and his voice became even more harsh. He said that humanity was weak and unprepared because they had sent only one ship to meet the mighty Calreth Imperium. He laughed at the idea that such a small vessel could represent any kind of real civilization. To him, the Helena and its crew were just insects waiting to be crushed under his boot. Sophie looked up from her station with fear clear on her young face. Her voice shook slightly as she reported that the Calreth ships were powering up their main weapons. Multiple targeting beams were now locked onto the Helena from at least 20 different directions. They had maybe 30 seconds before the aliens opened fire and turned their ship into burning debris. Daniel made his decision in that moment. His hand moved down to a red button on his command chair. The button was protected by a clear plastic cover that he had to flip up first. This was the emergency beacon, something he had hoped never to use in his entire career. Once he pressed it, there would be no going back. Everything would change. He looked directly at Vexthar's image on the screen and spoke in a voice that was suddenly cold as ice. He told the alien commander that he had made a terrible mistake. Vexthar thought humanity was weak because they sent one small ship, but that was not the reason at all. Humanity sent one ship because they hoped the Calreth would be reasonable and peaceful. They sent one ship to give the aliens a chance to do the right thing. Vexthar's eyes narrowed with confusion and then anger. He demanded to know what Daniel meant by giving him a chance. What could one tiny ship possibly do against the might of his battle fleet? Daniel smiled, but there was no humor in it, only grim certainty. He explained that he had just activated an emergency signal. In about 90 seconds, all of humanity would know exactly where the Calreth fleet was located, and in 15 minutes Vexthar would learn what happens when someone threatens human lives. For the first time, something like doubt crossed the alien commander's reptilian features. His confident posture shifted slightly. He insisted that Daniel must be lying because no species in the known galaxy could move a defensive fleet into position that quickly. It was impossible. The logistics alone would take hours or even days. Daniel had to be bluffing to buy time. Kyle checked his instruments and his own voice came out tight with fear. The Calreth weapons were fully charged now. All 47 ships were ready to fire. They had seconds left at most. Daniel sat back in his command chair and kept that same cold smile on his face. He told Vexthar that he had 15 minutes to reconsider his choices, but he suspected the alien was too proud and too stupid to back down now. The screen went dark as Vexthar cut the transmission. A split second later, the Helena shook violently as the first energy weapons hit their shields. Bright blue and green plasma bolts filled the space around them like a deadly light show. Sophie immediately redirected all available power to the defensive screens, pulling energy from life support and every non-essential system. The shields held, but the power levels were dropping fast with each new impact. Daniel grabbed the controls and threw the Helena into a sharp diving turn that made the artificial gravity systems scream in protest. A concentrated beam of pure energy passed through the space where they had been just a moment before. If he had been 1 second slower, that beam would have cut them in half. The ship groaned and creaked as he pushed it through maneuvers it was never designed to perform. Kyle kept his eyes locked on the chronometer display, counting down the minutes since the beacon activated. His voice was steady as he reported 11 minutes had passed. The response fleet should be close now. They had to be close. If his calculations were wrong about the fleet's position and response time, then none of them would live to regret the mistake. Sophie argued back, with stress making her voice sharp. She pointed out that if Kyle was wrong, they were all dead anyway. The shields were down to 40% power and dropping fast with every hit. She estimated they had 2 more minutes of protection left. Maybe 3 if she could squeeze a bit more power from the emergency reserves. Kyle insisted he was right, even though his hands were shaking on the controls. He explained that the 5th Fleet had been stationed at Proxima Way Station, exactly 4 jump points away from their current position. Commander Lisa Hayes was in charge of that fleet, and she was famous for never hesitating when Earth citizens were in danger. She would come. She had to come. Daniel threw the Helena into another spiral, narrowly avoiding 3 plasma bolts that converged on their position from different angles. The ship's structural integrity warnings were blaring across every console. Red lights flashed throughout the bridge. He knew that even if the fleet arrived in time, they were still just 1 diplomatic vessel against 47 warships built for conquest and destruction. But they had to survive long enough to matter, long enough to show the Calreth that humanity was not prey. Sophie's console suddenly lit up with new alerts, and her eyes went wide. Kyle saw it at the same moment, and his voice rose with barely controlled excitement mixed with relief. Jump signatures were appearing on their sensors. Multiple contacts coming in fast. Bearing 270 and distance dropping rapidly as they approached at combat speed. On the main view screen, reality itself seemed to tear open as brilliant blue portals formed in the fabric of space. Through each glowing rift came a human warship bearing the insignia of Earth's United Defense Fleet. First came the destroyers, sleek and deadly with their hulls covered in railgun batteries. Then the cruisers followed, each one showing the scars of previous battles. Finally, the carriers appeared and immediately began launching waves of small fighter craft that spread out in attack formation. A woman's voice came through the communication system, crisp and professional but carrying an edge of absolute fury beneath the calm surface. Commander Lisa Hayes identified herself and her fleet. She informed the Calreth vessels that they had fired on a diplomatic ship operating under protected status, according to interstellar law. She gave them 1 chance to power down their weapons and surrender. They had 30 seconds to comply. Daniel felt the tension drain from his shoulders as relief flooded through him. Sophie started crying quietly at her station, tears of relief streaming down her face. Kyle actually laughed, a slightly wild sound that came from someone who had been holding their breath for too long. But Daniel kept watching the tactical display because he knew what would come next. He knew the Calreth would not surrender without seeing the full extent of their mistake. Vexthar's response came through on an open channel that both fleets could hear. His voice was full of arrogance and contempt as he threatened Commander Hayes. He pointed out that the Calreth had 47 proven warships, while she had brought only 30 vessels. The humans were outnumbered and outgunned. He ordered her to retreat immediately or be destroyed along with the Helena. There was a brief pause, and then Commander Hayes spoke again. This time her voice carried something that almost sounded like pity. She told Vexthar that he really did not understand his situation. She would make it clear and simple for him. The Calreth were not outnumbered. They were surrounded. 10 seconds felt like an eternity as the Calreth fleet hung frozen in space, completely surrounded by human warships that had appeared from nowhere. Captain Daniel Pierce watched the tactical display aboard the Helena and saw the enemy formation breaking apart as individual commanders tried to decide whether to fight or surrender. Then Commander Vexthar made the choice that would seal his fate and the fate of his fleet. His voice came across all channels. filled with rage and wounded pride as he declared that the Calreth Imperium bowed to no one. He ordered all ships to open fire immediately. The 47 alien warships began shooting in every direction at once, no longer able to concentrate their overwhelming firepower on a single target. They were desperate and scattered and already beaten, even though they refused to admit it yet. The human response was instant and precise, like a surgical strike. Admiral George Carter's voice boomed across all communication frequencies as he gave the order for weapons free. He told his fleet to disable enemy ships where possible but destroy them where necessary. He said it was time to show the Calreth why humanity did not start fights but always finished them. The massive dreadnought Washington opened fire with its main railgun batteries. The sound inside the ship must have been deafening as the huge weapons launched tungsten slugs the size of small trucks at a fraction of light speed. The first volley hit 3 Calreth cruisers simultaneously. The kinetic impacts smashed through their shields like they were made of paper and punched clean through the hulls. Atmosphere vented into space in beautiful sparkling clouds of frozen air and water vapor. Sophie finally got control of her breathing and managed to stop crying as the Helena moved away from the main battle. They no longer had dozens of targeting locks on them. They could finally move without constant weapons fire chasing them through space. She reported that multiple Calreth vessels were breaking formation and trying to scatter in different directions. They were attempting to flee. Kyle watched his tactical screen and spoke with grim certainty. He said the fleeing ships would not make it far. The Fifth Fleet's fast attack wing was already moving to intercept them. Those human destroyers were built for speed and pursuit. They would run down every Calreth ship that tried to escape. Daniel activated the ship-wide communication system and addressed his crew. He told them they were moving to a safe observation distance. He knew everyone wanted revenge for what the Calreth had done to them, but their job was to survive and bear witness to what happened here. The fleet would handle the fighting. The Helena's crew needed to document everything for the historical record. On the bridge of the Washington, Admiral Carter stood with his hands clasped behind his back in a relaxed posture that contradicted the violence happening all around his ship. He watched the battle unfold on multiple displays with the calm expression of someone who had seen combat many times before. His tactical officer, Lieutenant Jake Morrison, coordinated the movements of 200 warships with smooth efficiency that came from years of training and experience. Jake reported that the 7th Fleet had disabled 12 enemy vessels so far. The 2nd Fleet had destroyed 3 more ships that had refused to power down their weapons even when given the chance. Calreth casualties were mounting rapidly, but they continued fighting with stubborn determination. Carter muttered that they were stubborn fools. He opened a direct channel to Commander Lisa Hayes and asked for her status report. Hayes responded immediately with her usual crisp efficiency. She informed the Admiral that the 5th Fleet had boxed in the Calreth command carrier, where Vexthar was directing his forces. She was awaiting orders on how to proceed. The Admiral's eyes narrowed as he considered his options. He ordered Hayes to disable the command carrier's weapon systems, but leave their shields and engines operational. He wanted Vexthar alive to deliver a message back to the Calreth Imperium. Dead martyrs could be useful to their enemies. Living failures served humanity's purposes better. The battle continued for another 17 minutes, but the outcome was never in doubt from the moment the human fleet arrived. The Calreth had numbers and individual firepower, but humanity had something far more valuable. They had coordination born from necessity and refined through bitter experience. They had tactics developed over centuries of human warfare. And they had cold-focused rage at seeing their people threatened. The human fighter craft were small and agile, piloted by men and women who had trained their entire adult lives for exactly this kind of combat. They danced between the larger capital ships with incredible precision, targeting specific weapon emplacements and engine cores with surgical strikes. The carrier groups kept launching wave after wave of these fighters, never giving the Calreth a moment to regroup or coordinate any kind of effective defense. Commander Hayes led her fleet in a devastating pincer movement that caught 6 Calreth destroyers in a crossfire. The alien ships tried to turn and fight, but they were caught between 2 groups of human warships. Within minutes, all 6 were burning hulks drifting through space. The 7th Fleet's commanding officer, Admiral Greg Palmer, executed a jump maneuver that brought his forces directly behind the Calreth battle line. This caused immediate chaos and panic among the alien crews who suddenly had enemies on all sides. The human warships fired with discipline and control. Every shot had a purpose. Every maneuver was coordinated with the ships around them. The Calreth fought bravely but individually. Each ship's captain made their own decisions without proper coordination with their fleetmates. It was like watching a pack of wolves fight a swarm of organized ants. The wolves were bigger and stronger individually, but the ants worked together and eventually overwhelmed them. Daniel watched from the Helena as another Calreth cruiser exploded in a ball of fire that quickly went out in the vacuum of space. Sophie had stopped watching the tactical display. She was staring at her hands and shaking slightly. Kyle kept his eyes locked on the battle, documenting everything with the ship's sensors for the official report. Finally, with 23 of his ships reduced to burning wreckage and 17 more disabled and drifting helplessly, Commander Vexthar made the call that would define the rest of his life. His voice came across all channels, but this time without any arrogance or pride. He sounded tired and defeated and perhaps frightened. He ordered all Calreth vessels to cease fire immediately. He repeated the command twice to make sure everyone heard. Then he spoke the words that no Calreth commander had spoken in over 300 years. He surrendered his fleet unconditionally. The human weapons fell silent across the entire battlefield. The fighters pulled back to holding positions but remained ready to resume combat at any moment. In the sudden quiet that followed, Admiral Carter's voice filled the void of space. He addressed the Calreth forces with formal military precision. He ordered them to power down all weapon systems and prepare to be boarded by human inspection teams. Any vessel that attempted to flee would be destroyed immediately without warning. Any vessel that powered up weapons would be destroyed immediately without warning. He told them they had come looking for easy conquest, but instead, they would leave with a lesson they would never forget. Daniel finally allowed himself to sink back into his command chair. His legs felt weak and his hands were shaking slightly with the after effects of adrenaline. Sophie was crying again, but this time with relief. Kyle just stared at the tactical display showing the graveyard of twisted metal and burning ships floating in the darkness. Daniel reached over and squeezed Sophie's shoulder gently. He told her it was over and they were safe now. Sophie whispered something about all those ships and all those people who had died. Even though they were enemies, they were still living beings who had families and homes and dreams. Daniel reminded her softly that the Calreth had made their choice. They had fired on a diplomatic vessel. They had been given multiple chances to stand down peacefully. Every death that happened here was a direct result of their commander's arrogance and refusal to listen to reason. Outside the Helena, the human fleet began the methodical work of securing the battlefield. Teams of Marines in armored suits began boarding the disabled Calreth vessels to ensure they had truly surrendered and were not preparing any kind of suicide attack. Medical ships moved among the wreckage looking for survivors from both sides. Intelligence officers began downloading data from captured computers to learn everything they could about the Calreth military and their empire. Commander Hayes contacted Daniel directly on a private channel. Her voice was gentle as she told him that he and his crew had performed admirably under impossible circumstances. The Helena had survived against odds that should have been fatal. Earth Command was already talking about commendations and medals for everyone aboard. Daniel told her that they had only survived because the fleet arrived when it did. Hayes laughed softly and reminded him that the fleet arrived because he had the courage to activate the emergency beacon. A lesser captain might have tried to negotiate or surrender rather than call for help. Daniel had trusted that humanity would answer, and his trust had been rewarded. Kyle finally tore his eyes away from the tactical display. 3 days after the battle that would become known across the galaxy as the First Warning, Captain Daniel Pierce sat in a conference room aboard the massive dreadnought Washington. He had already told his story 4 times to different groups of analysts and intelligence officers. Now he was telling it again to a 5th panel while Sophie and Kyle sat beside him looking exhausted but alive. Admiral George Carter stood at the head of the long table with his weathered face showing the lines and scars of a lifetime of military service. He told Daniel and his crew that they had performed admirably under circumstances that should have killed them. The Helena was being repaired in Earth orbit and would be returned to service within the month. However, the Admiral needed them to understand that the battle had implications far beyond just one skirmish in deep space. Lieutenant Jake Morrison activated a holographic display that floated above the center of the table. It showed a star map of this entire sector with dozens of different colored regions, representing various alien species and their territories. The map looked like a patchwork quilt of interstellar nations, each one with its own government and military and culture. Jake explained that the Calreth Imperium had been the dominant military power in this region for over 300 years. They had conquered or subjugated 73 different species, exactly as Commander Vexthar had claimed. When the Calreth encountered the Helena, they followed their standard operating procedure, which was to overwhelm, intimidate, and conquer any new species they discovered. Sophie spoke softly, pointing out that humanity was not standard in any way. The Admiral agreed with a slight smile. He said that neither humanity nor their response was anything the Calreth had expected. The Calreth were learning that lesson right now in the prison cells where they were being held. But the real question, facing Earth Command, was what message this battle sent to the rest of the galaxy. The holographic display changed to show recordings that had been intercepted from dozens of different alien communication networks. These were news broadcasts, government meetings, and public forums, all discussing the same topic with various levels of fear and wonder. They were all talking about humanity. One recording showed a crystalline being that looked like it was made of living glass. The translator converted its musical tones into English words expressing shock and awe. The being said that humanity had sent a single ship for first contact, and when that ship was threatened, they brought 200 warships within minutes. What kind of species had that level of military coordination and rapid response capability? Another broadcast showed an insectoid creature with multiple arms, addressing what appeared to be a legislative body. Its voice through the translator was incredulous as it pointed out that the Calreth fleet had been defeated in under 20 minutes. 20 minutes to destroy or capture nearly half of their sector fleet. This species called humanity had not negotiated or threatened or postured. They had simply arrived and won. A third recording came from a species that looked almost humanoid except for pale blue skin and large dark eyes. The being's voice trembled with uncertainty as it spoke about 3 centuries of paying tribute to the Calreth because everyone feared their military might. Now a species that nobody had ever heard of had shattered that military power in a single engagement. The being asked what this meant for the balance of power and who exactly were these humans. Admiral Carter paused the recordings and looked around the table at the assembled officers. He explained that these kinds of discussions were happening right now across 37 different species communication networks. In just 3 days, humanity had gone from being completely unknown to being the most talked about military force in this entire sector of the galaxy. Kyle asked the obvious question about whether this was good or bad for Earth. Commander Lisa Hayes, who had been standing quietly in the corner of the room, stepped forward to answer. She said that it depended entirely on what humanity did next. Some alien species were terrified of humans and saw them as a potential threat. Others were already sending diplomatic requests, hoping to establish alliances and trade agreements. And a few were wondering if humanity was just another Calreth Imperium, only with better technology and faster ships. Daniel felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He asked if that was what they were becoming. Just another empire that conquered through military force. They had destroyed most of the Calreth fleet after all. They had killed thousands of alien beings in less than half an hour. Hayes countered that the Calreth had fired first on a diplomatic vessel operating under protected status, according to interstellar law. Humanity had given them multiple chances to stand down peacefully. Every action the human fleet took was defensive and proportional to the threat. They had not pursued fleeing ships beyond the immediate battle zone. They had not bombarded Calreth colonies or civilian targets. They had fought only the military forces that chose to fight them. Carter added grimly that explaining defensive necessity to species who had watched empires rise and fall for thousands of years would be difficult. To those ancient civilizations, humanity looked like either potential saviors or potential tyrants. They would not know which until they saw what humans did with the power they had just demonstrated so dramatically. Jake pulled up another image on the holographic display, this one showing Commander Vexthar sitting in a detention cell. The once proud Calreth commander looked diminished and defeated, his reptilian features drawn with exhaustion and shame. Jake explained that human intelligence officers had been interrogating all the survivors from the battle. The Calreth Imperium was apparently in chaos back in their home systems. Losing 23 ships destroyed and 17 captured meant they had lost nearly a third of their entire sector fleet in one engagement. Sophie asked what the Calreth government was saying about the defeat. Carter replied that they had requested formal negotiations with Earth. Not a complete surrender yet, but they wanted to talk. They needed to understand what kind of species they had encountered and what humanity wanted from them. Daniel leaned back in his chair and thought about the situation carefully. He said that humanity was standing at a crossroads. They could become conquerors and build an empire through fear and military force, or they could be peacemakers and build alliances through cooperation and mutual benefit. Hayes suggested that humanity could actually be both at the same time. Fear kept aggressive species at bay and prevented attacks. Hope built alliances and encouraged cooperation. The difficult part was knowing when to show which face to the galaxy. Carter nodded slowly in agreement. Then he dropped the bombshell that changed everything for Daniel and his crew. The Helena would be completely refitted and upgraded with proper defensive weapons, better shields, and faster engines. It would no longer be just a diplomatic courier. And then Daniel and his crew would be going back out into the galaxy, not as simple messengers but as official representatives of all humanity. Daniel asked what exactly that meant in practical terms. Carter explained that Daniel would visit every major species in this sector one by one. He would meet with their leaders and tell them humanity's story. He would explain what Earth stood for and what humans believed in. Kyle asked what story they were supposed to tell. Carter said simply that they would tell the truth. Humanity started as explorers who became warriors, because circumstances forced them to fight. Humans would defend themselves and their allies with overwhelming force when necessary, but they did not seek conquest or domination. Humanity judged other species by their actions rather than their appearance or history. Humans could be the best friends or the worst enemies that anyone in this galaxy had ever encountered, and the choice of which relationship to have was entirely up to the other species. Sophie whistled softly and pointed out that this was enormous pressure to put on one ship and one crew. Carter admitted with a slight smile that yes, it was enormous pressure. Every species in known space was watching to see what humanity would do next. The Battle of the First Warning was just the opening chapter of a much longer story. Now came the difficult work of winning the peace after demonstrating the ability to wage devastating war. The holographic star map glowed with dozens of colored regions representing different civilizations. Each one was making decisions right now about how to respond to humanity's sudden and violent arrival on the galactic stage. Some would seek friendship. Others would prepare for war. Many would wait and watch to see which path humanity truly walked. Daniel asked when they would leave on this new mission. Hayes told him 2 weeks, which would give Earth Command time to refit the Helena and give the crew time to receive intensive diplomatic training. They would be carrying the hopes and dreams of 8 billion humans. They would also be carrying the hopes of potentially dozens of alien species who saw humanity as their chance to break free from oppression and tyranny. Sophie asked quietly what would happen if they failed in this mission. Carter's expression became hard as stone. He said that failure would prove humanity was just another empire, with advanced weapons and aggressive ambitions. The galaxy would unite against Earth the same way they should have united against the Calreth centuries ago, but failed to do. 1 full year had passed since the Battle of the First Warning, and the galaxy bore little resemblance to what it had been before. Captain Daniel Pierce stood in the command center of the Helena II as it drifted in orbit above a planet called Viridian Prime, home to a species of aquatic beings who had just signed their membership into the Council of Free Worlds. This made them the 47th species to join the growing alliance, a number that carried bitter irony since the Calreth had once claimed dominion over exactly that many conquered peoples. Sophie Grant worked at her station coordinating the final details of the membership ceremony that had just concluded on the planet's surface. She had become an expert at managing the complex cultural protocols required when dozens of different species tried to work together. Every species had their own traditions about greeting and negotiation and celebration. Learning to respect all of them without giving offense had become her specialty. Kyle Bennett stood beside Daniel looking at the long-range sensor displays. He reported that the Fifth Fleet was maintaining its patrol route through this sector right on schedule. Commander Lisa Hayes and her ships had become a permanent fixture in this region of space, a constant reminder that humanity stood ready to defend the new order they had helped create. Daniel thought about how much had changed in just 12 months. The Calreth Imperium had dissolved into 3 separate independent nations as their formerly unified government collapsed under the weight of military defeat and moral bankruptcy. Most of the Calreth people had accepted the new reality and were working hard to rebuild their society based on cooperation rather than conquest. A few extremist groups still talked about restoring the old empire, but they had no military power and little public support. The species that had been under Calreth control were flourishing in ways that would have seemed impossible a year ago. Trade routes that had been restricted for centuries were now open to everyone. Technology that the Calreth had hoarded was being shared freely. Species that had been isolated were making first contact with distant civilizations and discovering entirely new possibilities. Admiral George Carter's face appeared on the main display screen, transmitting from a ceremony happening simultaneously on Earth. He was addressing a gathering of human and alien diplomats at the opening of the new Galactic Affairs building in Geneva. His weathered face showed satisfaction as he spoke about humanity's role in the changing galaxy. Carter explained that humanity had been forced to make a choice 1 year ago. They could have used their demonstrated military superiority to carve out an empire and dominate this entire region through fear and force. Instead, they had chosen a harder path. They chose to build coalitions and foster cooperation. They chose to share rather than hoard, to protect rather than exploit. Some critics on Earth had argued that humanity was being too generous and too trusting. They worried that sharing advanced technology and military tactics would eventually allow other species to threaten Earth itself. But Carter and the other military leaders understood something that the critics did not. True security did not come from being stronger than everyone else. It came from having allies who shared your values and would stand beside you when threats emerged. Daniel received a priority communication from Admiral Greg Palmer, who commanded the 7th Fleet. Palmer reported that they had just intercepted a distress call from a mining colony in the outer reaches of the sector. A species called the Ravagers, aggressive nomads from beyond known space, had attacked the colony and were in the process of slaughtering the population. Daniel felt his blood run cold at the report. This was exactly the kind of test that everyone had been dreading. The Council of Free Worlds had been built on principles of mutual defense and collective security. If they failed to respond to this crisis, the entire alliance would be revealed as nothing but empty words and broken promises. He asked Palmer for the colony's location and military situation. Palmer replied that the colony was home to about 3,000 civilians from 5 different species, working together to extract rare minerals. The Ravagers had brought 4 warships and were systematically destroying the colony's defenses. At current rate of destruction, everyone on the surface would be dead within 2 hours. Sophie looked up from her station with fear clear in her eyes. She asked if the 5th Fleet could reach the colony in time. Kyle checked the tactical calculations and shook his head grimly. The 5th Fleet was too far away. Even jumping at maximum speed, they would arrive at least 3 hours too late to save anyone. Daniel made his decision instantly. He ordered Kyle to plot a jump directly to the colony's coordinates. Sophie protested that the Helena II was a diplomatic vessel, not a warship. They had defensive weapons, but nothing that could fight 4 Ravager ships designed specifically for raiding and destruction. Daniel cut her off sharply. He reminded her that the Helena II flew under Earth's flag and carried the promise that humanity would protect those who could not protect themselves. If they ran away now because the odds were unfavorable, every species in the galaxy would know that humanity's promises meant nothing when tested. He opened a channel to Admiral Carter and quickly explained the situation. Carter's expression became hard as stone. He gave Daniel permission to engage but ordered him to activate his emergency beacon immediately. The 9th Fleet was conducting exercises nearby and could reach the colony within 30 minutes. Daniel just needed to keep the Ravagers occupied until reinforcements arrived. The Helena II jumped into the system and immediately came under fire from the 4 Ravager warships. These vessels were ugly and brutal-looking, covered in weapon ports and armor plating. They had been painted with symbols that represented all the species they had conquered or destroyed over their long history of raiding. Daniel threw the ship into evasive maneuvers as plasma bolts filled the space around them. Sophie worked frantically to keep their shields powered while simultaneously broadcasting on all frequencies, announcing that this colony was under the protection of the Council of Free Worlds. Any attack on it was an attack on all 47 member species. The Ravager commander responded with a transmission that showed a scarred and battle-hardened face belonging to a species humanity had never encountered before. The commander laughed at Sophie's warning. They said the Ravagers had heard stories about humanity and their supposed great fleet, but they saw only one ship here, a diplomatic vessel with minimal weapons. The commander gave Daniel one chance to flee or be destroyed along with the colony. Kyle reported that the emergency beacon was active. He also noted that 3 of the 4 Ravager ships were turning away from the colony to focus on the Helena II. That was good because it meant fewer weapons hitting the colonists on the surface. But it was also terrifying because the Helena II could not survive concentrated fire from 3 warships for very long. Daniel opened a channel to the colony and identified himself. He told the survivors to get everyone into the deepest shelters available. Human reinforcements were coming, but the Helena II needed to buy them time. A voice responded from the surface, belonging to a Zanari colonist named Ice Dancing on Water. The voice was shaking with fear, but also with hope. They said that humanity had already saved their entire species once. They trusted that rescue would come again. The battle that followed was desperate and chaotic. Daniel used every trick he had learned in his years of service, pushing the Helena II through maneuvers that made the artificial gravity systems scream in protest. Sophie kept the shields active by routing power from every non-essential system. Kyle coordinated with the colony's remaining defense platforms to create crossfire opportunities that forced the Ravagers to divide their attention. Minutes stretched into eternities as the Helena II took hit after hit. The shields were failing section by section. Small fires broke out on multiple decks. The crew worked frantically to contain the damage and keep the ship operational. Daniel knew they could not last much longer, but they had to try. Then space tore open, and through the brilliant blue portals came the 9th Fleet right on schedule. 20 human warships emerged from jump space and immediately opened fire on the Ravager vessels. The surprise was total and devastating. The Ravagers had been so focused on destroying the Helena II that they had not noticed the incoming jump signatures until it was too late. The 9th Fleet's commander, Admiral Patricia Monroe, transmitted on all channels. She informed the Ravagers that they had attacked a colony under Council protection. They could surrender immediately or be destroyed. There would be no third option and no negotiation. The Ravager commander made the fatal mistake of trying to fight. Their 4 ships turned to engage the 9th Fleet in what must have seemed like reasonable odds. But these were human warships crewed by veterans who had trained for exactly this kind of combat. The battle lasted less than 8 minutes. 3 Ravager ships were reduced to burning wreckage. The 4th lost its engines and weapons and drifted helplessly as human Marines prepared to board it. Daniel slumped back in his command chair as the immediate danger passed. The Helena II was badly damaged but intact. Sophie was crying again, but this time with relief and exhaustion. Kyle just stared at his displays. 6 months had passed since the Battle of the First Warning, and the galaxy had transformed in ways both obvious and subtle. Captain Daniel Pierce stood in the observation lounge of the newly built Helena II, watching as shuttlecraft from 14 different alien species approached his ship. Today would mark the first multi-species diplomatic summit hosted by humanity, and every decision made here would ripple across the stars for decades to come. The original Helena had been retired to a museum on Earth where millions of visitors came every day to see the small, battered ship that had changed everything. The new vessel carried the same name but was something completely different. It was a state-of-the-art diplomatic cruiser with defensive weapons strong enough to fight off a small fleet, but designed primarily for hosting negotiations and cultural exchanges between different civilizations. Sophie Grant walked up beside Daniel, carrying a digital tablet filled with the final attendance numbers. She had been promoted to lieutenant commander after the battle, and now served as the Helena II's diplomatic coordinator. She reported that 14 species had confirmed their attendance, including 3 that humanity had never had any direct contact with before. The various alien governments were calling this gathering the Council of Free Worlds. Daniel asked what they were supposed to be free from. Kyle Bennett joined them at the viewport and answered the question. He had also been promoted and now served as chief diplomatic liaison, He explained that these species wanted to be free from anyone who thought they could push them around through military force. The Calreth Imperium had been in full retreat for the past 6 months. 12 species had already declared independence from Calreth control. Another 6 were in open-armed rebellion. Daniel watched as a shuttle bearing crystalline beings from Sector 7 docked smoothly with the Helena II. These were the Zanari, a species that had lived under Calreth occupation for nearly 2 centuries. Their lead diplomat was named Crystal Song Through Ice, and had specifically requested that humanity host this summit rather than holding it in neutral territory. Sophie asked if there had been any communication from the Calreth government. Daniel nodded and explained that the Calreth had sent an observer to watch the proceedings. It was not Commander Vexthar, who had been removed from military service and was currently facing war crimes charges in the Calreth justice system. But the Calreth wanted to see what kind of coalition was forming and whether they could salvage anything from the disaster they had created. Admiral Carter's face appeared on a wall display, transmitting in real time from Earth Command headquarters. He told Daniel that he was watching the arrivals remotely and that this gathering was unprecedented in known galactic history. 14 different species were meeting as complete equals, with humans serving as conveners rather than conquerors. He asked how the mood seemed among the arriving delegates. Daniel replied that everyone seemed cautiously optimistic, but there was an underlying current of fear running through all the preliminary meetings. Fear that the Calreth might somehow rebuild their military and seek revenge. Fear that humanity might become too powerful and turn into the next oppressive empire. Fear about what the future would bring now that the old order had been shattered. Carter said that fear kept people honest and cautious, but hope gave them reason to work together toward common goals. Daniel needed to provide both emotions in careful balance during the summit. He needed to remind everyone why they were here while also showing them a path forward. The summit convened in the Helena Seku's main conference chamber, which had been designed as a perfect circle with no head position and no place of greater importance. Every species delegation sat at the same sized table with the same quality chairs and the same access to translation technology. Advanced artificial intelligence systems translated every word in real time, systems that had been refined through 6 months of intensive linguistic study and cultural exchange. Daniel opened the proceedings with words that had been carefully written by Earth's best diplomatic experts. But at the last minute before speaking, he had thrown away the prepared speech and decided to speak from his heart instead. He told the gathered delegates that 6 months ago the Helena had entered this sector on a peaceful mission. They had been met with threats and immediate violence. Humanity had responded with overwhelming military force, not because they wanted to conquer anyone, but because it was necessary to protect their people. He continued by saying that humanity could have easily taken the Calreth's place as the dominant power in this region. They had proven their military superiority. They had the advantage of surprise and advanced technology. They could have demanded tribute and resources and territory from everyone. Instead, Earth had opened communication channels and helped species establish mutual defense agreements. Humanity had shared technology freely without demanding payment or political concessions. Crystal Song Through Ice spoke next, and their crystalline body refracted the chamber's lights into beautiful rainbow patterns across the walls. They asked the question that everyone was thinking. Why had humanity not taken advantage of their victory? They had the power to build an empire, but instead chose to build bridges. What was the reason? Daniel looked at Sophie and Kyle before answering. He explained that humanity had learned through bitter and bloody experience on their own world that empires built on fear and military domination always eventually collapsed. They fell to internal rebellion or external pressure, or simply to their own moral decay over time. Humanity did not want to rule an empire. They wanted partners and allies and friends. They wanted to help build a galaxy where any ship could travel safely from one end to the other without fear of attack or conquest. An insectoid being from the Hive Collective clicked their mandibles together in a pattern that the translator software rendered as skeptical amusement. They pointed out that humanity's military had demonstrated remarkable efficiency in destroying the Calreth fleet in under 20 minutes. Humans clearly understood warfare very well. How could the other species be certain that humanity would not eventually use that capability against them when it became convenient or profitable? Kyle answered this challenge with a steady and confident voice. He said that war was expensive and brutal and ultimately self-defeating for everyone involved. Every ship that humanity destroyed in that battle represented resources that could have been used for exploration or scientific research or improving life for Earth's citizens. Humans had fought because they were forced to fight. They had won because they prepared for the worst while hoping for the best. But fighting was never humanity's first choice. It was always the absolute last resort. The summit continued for 3 full days with delegates living aboard the Helena II and meeting in both formal sessions and informal gatherings. Species that had been enemies under Calreth rule began finding common ground and shared interests. Trade agreements were drafted and refined. Mutual defense pacts were proposed and debated. Slowly and carefully, the basic framework for a new kind of galactic community began to take shape. On the morning of the 3rd day, the Calreth observer requested formal permission to address the entire assembly. The conference chamber fell into complete silence as everyone turned to look at the reptilian diplomat. This was a younger Calreth officer named Saren, whose scales were brighter and less scarred than the older generation of military. Commander Saren stood and faced the assembled delegates with what appeared to be genuine humility. They said that their people had made a grave error in judgment when they encountered humanity. The Calreth had assumed that military strength gave them the right to dominate and subjugate other species. They had believed that power meant the right to rule over the weak. The humans had taught them a painful but necessary lesson. True strength came from restraint and discipline. Real power came from unity and cooperation rather than conquest and fear. Crystal Song Through Ice asked the direct question that everyone wanted answered. Was the Calreth Imperium surrendering its territorial claims and freeing all the species under its control? Saren took a deep breath before responding. They explained that the Calreth Imperium as it had existed for 3 centuries was finished and could not be rebuilt. The Calreth people could either adapt to the new reality or be swept aside by the changing times. They chose adaptation and change. The Calreth were prepared to release all subjugated species immediately, to pay reparations where possible, and to join this new council as equals rather than as rulers. The chamber exploded into chaos as delegates from a dozen species began shouting questions and accusations simultaneously. Some expressed complete disbelief that the Calreth would actually follow through on such promises. Others were angry that mere words and promises seemed insufficient punishment for centuries of oppression and suffering. A few voices spoke cautiously in favor of giving the Calreth a chance to prove their sincerity through actions. Daniel raised his hand and called for silence. When the chamber finally quieted, he spoke carefully. He said that the decision of whether to accept the Calreth offer was not his to make alone. Every species represented here had suffered under Calreth rule, or witnessed their aggression firsthand.